Imagine a secret so profound it redefined war, yet so vast it required the construction of an entire fully functioning city from scratch to keep it. Imagine 75,000 people living, working, falling in love, and raising families within a heavily guarded fence, all without knowing the true purpose of their labor. They called it the secret city. The world would come to know its ultimate product as the deadliest weapon ever conceived, the atomic bomb. The invisible war, spies, sabotage, and the silence of thousands. The single greatest operational challenge of the Manhattan Project was not technical, it was secrecy. The fear was omnipresent: fear of German spies, fear of internal sabotage, and perhaps most terrifyingly, fear of the Soviets. Colonel Leslie Groves, the project's military chief, understood that a security failure in Oak Ridge could doom the entire effort, potentially handing Hitler the keys to the atomic age. To combat this, Oak Ridge became the most surveilled, security-conscious civilian community in American history. The Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, descended on the valley not just to guard the fences, but to listen to every whisper. Postal workers were trained to look for suspicious addresses. Phone calls were monitored, and rumor-mongering was treated as a potential act of treason. Every single one of the 75,000 residents was required to sign non-disclosure agreements, but the real control came from the pervasive atmosphere of compartmentalization. No single worker knew the full scope of the project. The physicists at the Y-12 plant understood the principle of electromagnetic separation, but were unaware that the parallel K-25 plant was pursuing gaseous diffusion. The laborers building the mile-long K-25 structure knew nothing of the delicate science occurring within it. It was a giant puzzle, and only Groves and a handful of top scientists possessed the complete picture. This system of compartmentalization, while effective against accidental leaks, did not stop the enemy who was already inside the gates: Soviet espionage. While American intelligence was focused primarily on the Nazis, Soviet agents, motivated by Stalin's paranoia and ambition, were aggressively targeting the project's intellectual centers. The most damaging leaks didn't come from the blue-collar workers in Tennessee, but from the theoretical laboratories. The most notorious atomic spy, Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist working for the British mission, was feeding critical design and physics data from the Los Alamos lab. Though he never set foot in Oak Ridge, the information he stole about the necessary quantities and purification processes directly impacted the Soviet Union's ability to quickly build their own bomb, bypassing years of research. But Oak Ridge had its own vulnerabilities. The sheer size of the workforce meant that background checks were often rushed. The security personnel had to track thousands of individuals: engineers, scientists, cooks, and janitors, many of whom had left their previous lives quickly for the promise of high wartime wages. The CIC maintained extensive files on employees suspected of communist sympathies or even just loose lips, a detailed archive of everyday life and political opinions in the secret city. For the residents, this meant a constant, unnerving awareness that their actions, their conversations, and their associations were always under observation, an invisible layer of constraint beneath the facade of a cheerful, company-run town.
The social experiment, race, class, and the atomic dream. The construction and operation of Oak Ridge were a microcosm of mid-century America, complete with its stark inequalities, all magnified by the project's unique demands. The massive labor force was highly segregated, a reflection of the Jim Crow South in which the city was situated. African-American laborers, recruited in large numbers, were essential for the brutal, demanding construction work. They were housed in Happy Valley, a sprawling, hastily constructed camp separate from the main city. Their living conditions were notoriously poor, often tents or crude barracks, lacking the paved roads, modern amenities, and community spaces provided to the white workers. They were paid higher wages than they could get elsewhere in the South, but they were excluded from the city's social life and the majority of the skilled technical jobs. This created a profound, silent injustice at the very heart of the project aimed at preserving democracy. Their contribution was invaluable, yet their sacrifices, even the simple loss of dignity, went largely unacknowledged until decades later. Conversely, the highly skilled technical staff and scientists, the intellectual elite of the operation, were paid handsomely and given the best housing. But their lives were ruled by a different kind of pressure, the relentless demands of the physics. The Calutron girls at Y12, for instance, represented a massive shift in wartime labor. These young women, often in their late teens and early 20s, were plucked from high school or secretarial pools and thrust into operating complex, enormous machinery. Their training was purely rote. They did not understand the science, only the procedure. They were taught that if the needle on the giant dials deviated even slightly, the war effort could be compromised. This created an extraordinary hidden stress. They were performing one of the most critical, delicate tasks in world history, utterly ignorant of the stakes, yet acutely aware of the military urgency. They saw their work as repetitive, frustrating, but absolutely vital to ending the war and bringing their brothers and sweethearts home. The children of Oak Ridge grew up in an environment unlike any other in America. Their hometown had a curfew, checkpoints, and a massive, continuous fence. They attended schools run by the government and understood instinctively that their parents worked in places they could not discuss. For these atomic kids, the sudden explosive revelation of August 1945 was not just a news flash. It was the moment they finally understood their childhood, that the huge humming buildings and the armed guards were not just strange quirks of their town, but the most important secret in the world. The power of the silver and the barrier crisis. The story of the Manhattan Project is defined by moments of extreme crisis and audacious, high-stakes solutions. None was more dramatic than the twin challenges of the silver and the K-25 barrier. The decision to borrow 17,000 tons of silver from the U.S. Treasury was perhaps the most eccentric financial move in American history. When the project realized the sheer amount of copper needed for the Y-12 Calutron magnets would cripple the rest of the war effort, they pivoted to silver. General Groves famously asked a Treasury official, "What's the purity of the silver?" The official replied, "We have no purity of silver. We have only money." The silver was used for conductors, formed into gigantic heavy coils that wrapped around the massive calutrons. The fact that this vast quantity of money was melted, used for wiring, and then meticulously accounted for and returned after the war solidified the legendary, almost fictional quality of the project's scale. More critically, there was the K-25 barrier crisis. The mile-long gaseous diffusion plant, K-25, depended on a revolutionary porous membrane, the barrier, to separate the lighter U-235 gas from the heavier U-238 gas. The pores in this barrier had to be infinitesimally small, less than a millionth of an inch, and the material had to withstand the highly corrosive uranium gas. The initial designs failed disastrously and repeatedly. For months, the entire $500 million K-25 complex, the largest building under one roof in the world, sat idle, awaiting a functioning barrier. This failure was so profound it nearly sank the entire project. Groves, refusing to put all his eggs in one basket, frantically increased investment in the less efficient Y-12 and a new plutonium production effort in Hanford, Washington. Finally, through a desperate, top-priority nationwide effort involving multiple corporations and universities, a workable, albeit fragile, nickel-based barrier material was devised and produced just in time, allowing K-25 to start feeding low-enriched uranium to Y-12 for final purification in early 1945. The bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, Little Boy, was a product of 3 separate experimental gigantic processes all running simultaneously and feeding one another at the secret city. The enduring legacy, birth of the nuclear age. When the fences came down in the late 1940s, Oak Ridge was forced to confront its true identity. It was no longer a temporary military installation. It was a city with a permanent destiny tied to the atom. The transition from a military-run fiefdom to a civilian city was slow and awkward. The federal government continued to own the land, the utilities, and the housing, essentially acting as the world's largest, most powerful landlord. It wasn't until 1959 that Oak Ridge was officially turned over to its citizens, allowing them to purchase the homes they had been renting for nearly 2 decades. The real enduring impact, however, lay in science. The former X-10 pilot plant evolved into the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which pivoted immediately to peaceful uses of the atom. In 1946, ORNL began shipping radioisotopes, byproducts of the nuclear reactors, to hospitals and research facilities globally. This single act launched the entire field of nuclear medicine, using Oak Ridge materials to diagnose and treat diseases like cancer worldwide. The secret city instantly became a city of healing. The vast K-25 and Y-12 complexes became the industrial heart of the American Cold War. K-25 provided the enriched uranium for nuclear submarines and power plants, and Y-12 refined the materials for the national defense stockpile. The secret city became the permanent engine of the nuclear age, shaping global geopolitics and the domestic energy landscape for the next half-century. The legacy is one of unparalleled complexity. A city founded on secrecy and segregation ultimately pioneered the most critical areas of modern science, from computing to nuclear medicine. The residents who built the bomb did so with patriotism and silence, and their town remains a testament to what American scientific and industrial power, united by a terrifying purpose, could achieve: the absolute power that simultaneously ended a world war and began a new, dangerous era.